new sodal scholars come from many different countries and regions of the world these days. And the history of sodal is somewhat different in these different regions. I can speak more clearly to the history in the United States, but I just think that people ought to be aware that if they're coming from the UK or from Canada or Australia or New Zealand, Hong Kong, that will be one answer or set of answers that differs from the one I'm about to give. In the United States, the phrase, the scholarship of teaching, originated with Ernest Boyer, who was an earlier president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. I, in fact, was working with him at that time. The book in question was Scholarship Reconsidered, Priorities of the Professoriate. It was written as an entree into what was then a major source of controversy in U.S. higher education, which had to do with the teaching versus research divide. This was his intervention to say, we need to get away from that stale old controversy and rethink what being a scholar means. And he divided the work of the academic intellectual, into four kinds that were interrelated, admittedly, but that were distinct. The scholarship of discovery, which is typically what we mean by basic research. The scholarship of application, which was then seen as what we mean by applied research, but has since become more widely known as the scholarship of engagement, typically referring to community engagement by people with an academic home. The scholarship of integration had a couple of different meanings, but it had to do with the interdisciplinary work of pulling together what we know about a particular area from a variety of different perspectives and making that available typically to a broader educated audience. If you kind of think of the essays that come out in areas like the New York Review of Books or things like that, it was that public intellectual stance, a broad scope that he was trying to get at. And then the scholarship of teaching, which was admittedly not too well defined at that point, but that had a profound influence on the discussion about faculty work in the United States. That was a very interesting part of our history because there was an association at that time that was going strong called the American Association of Higher Education. It was led by a man named Russ Edgerton, and it had many, it had annual meetings of various kinds, and it became a forum for airing these ideas about faculty work. They had a special conference for 10 years in a row called the Conference on Faculty Roles and Rewards that was for many of those years led by a man named Gene Rice, who had worked with us at the Carnegie Foundation on that very report, Scholarship Reconsidered. That became a forum for institutions of all kinds, for faculty and administrators to report on how this reconsideration of faculty roles was going, not only for the scholarship of teaching, but for the scholarship of engagement and the scholarship of integration, and even to some extent rethinking the scholarship of discovery. And alliances, networks were formed. It was a very important era, probably early 1990s through the early 2000s. One of the people who was much involved in those was a man named Lee Shulman and a woman named Pat Hutchngs, who I mentioned earlier in this interview. Lee became the president of the Carnegie Foundation. Pat became the vice president. And under the two of them, and with myself as a partner, as a continuing member of the Carnegie Foundation team, it led to the Carnegie Academy for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and the development of a whole network of leaders of this work, body of work, which was all connected. So I think that's very important about the history of the work in the United States. It had a center for a long time, but it was never centralized because it had these other organizations that provided a place for us to have that conversation, which the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning has to some extent now taken up.
The history of our field is, it's not a clean sort of history. There certainly have been people doing research on education for a long time. And many of those people, object to there being some new territory because it's already there. It's called educational research. The particular phrase emerged from Boyer's book, in which he identified within the field of scholarly activity 4 categories. And they're what we call research, he called discovery, teaching and learning. The one that often gets missed is integration, that there are people who don't do any discovery, but who can see what pieces of discovery together become. And then a scholarship of engagement or application, which already had a place, though sometimes thought to be a lower place in the hierarchy. So when that term began to be used, it sort of appeared somewhat suddenly. And it was not clear where the term was going, what was going to happen to the field. Some people jumped on the bandwagon and sort of said, well, this is a more interdisciplinary, perhaps less methodologically bound form of research. But still it is research, and I think missed the boat and put it back into the category of discovery. Boyer had a category for that. And so what was different then about this particular form of inquiry was that it was not driven by the usual constraints of disciplinary study, whether that discipline was education or something else, but was intended to be maybe a little more organic, a little more okay to be connected inside a real class, doesn't have to have random assignment. So as that sense of a less methodologically bound, distinct from the scholarship of discovery about education, that's really what gave this some movement when people found that kind of a community that was different enough from the existing community.
Well, I suppose it is safe for every new scholar to go back to Boyer and Boyer's original concept and the first few books that came out of Carnegie Foundation about scholarship assessed and scholarship reconsidered. And these are really historical resources by now, but I think they are the foundations. I would say that any of the books that came out of Carnegie Foundation that have case studies, these really are very important, not necessarily scholarly texts in all cases, but I think they allow people to grasp how this came about.
One of the best things to know is that in almost every instance where sodal now has a lovely foothold and a stable existence in a given institution or in a given department or just a group of people, in almost every case that started at a grassroots level and worked its way from the bottom up. There's some question as to how far up these things work, whether they get to be on the radar of people who are in charge of faculties who are senior administrators. That's another interesting debate. But to me, the defining historical characteristic of sodal is that it has been and continues to be a bottom-up kind of thing. I spent about 20 years working in educational development, where my main job was to run a unit and helped people teach better. There was tremendous political work involved there. Most of the work that I was doing as someone in charge of that unit was helping the university come to value teaching, period, before you actually put in the energy to improve it. And we're getting somewhere with that. But that struggle still goes on to convince people this is something they should do. There's cajoling, there's arm twisting, there's arguing. I don't do that in the sodal world. When we established our Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at the University of British Columbia, my interactions with people changed almost immediately from trying to talk them into the value of something to trying to find ways for them to do what they were passionate about already. That's a very important piece of the history. That's why it starts there, I think. So if you're an individual and you're interested because it's a passion you have, maybe a passion that you've suppressed for some time for various reasons, the history tells you you're not alone when it comes to the scholarship of teaching and learning and people caring about it.
One of the interesting developments in the scholarship of teaching and learning sort of historically was fairly early on, at least in my experience, and that was the insight that students needed to be more involved in this work. The original impulse was faculty should be looking at students and their learning, but happily, quite a number of people got onto the fact that students ought to be participating in that process, and on an important and diverse group of campuses, students became active co-collaborators in this work. And that's an idea that's really taken off and has now become really sort of an important, I won't say standard, but sort of criterion and expectation for work in many settings. So I think that's an important development historically in this work that I expect to see develop and move ahead with this with the practice of the scholarship of teaching and learning.